February 26, 1991. The Iraqi desert, 70 kilometers west of the Kuwaiti border. Captain H.R. McMaster stood in the turret of his M1A1 Abrams tank, Eagle Troop, 2nd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and watched the sandstorm that had reduced visibility to less than 1,000 meters all afternoon begin to lift just enough to reveal what was ahead of his formation. Tanks, dozens of them, dug into prepared positions, their turrets and hulls visible now as the blowing sand thinned, arranged in a defensive line that extended along a ridge that intelligence had not specifically identified as a major defensive position. McMaster's squadron had been advancing east through the desert for 2 days as part of the broad armored sweep that General Norman Schwarzkopf had designed as the decisive maneuver of the ground war, the famous left hook that would swing American and coalition armored forces around the western flank of Iraqi forces in Kuwait and into the rear of the Iraqi army before it could react. The advance had been remarkably fast. The Iraqi army, which had been the 4th largest in the world before the war began, had been subjected to 38 days of air attacks that had degraded its command and control, destroyed significant portions of its armor and artillery, and reduced the morale of frontline units to the point where surrenders had become commonplace as coalition ground forces approached. What 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment had not encountered yet, in 2 days of advance that had produced numerous small engagements against scattered Iraqi positions, was the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard. The Republican Guard was different from the conventional Iraqi army units that coalition forces had been encountering. These were Saddam Hussein's most trusted and most capable formations, equipped with the best Soviet-supplied equipment in the Iraqi inventory, including T-72 tanks that represented a significant capability advance over the older T-55s and T-62s that made up most of the Iraqi armored force. The Republican Guard units had been positioned as the strategic reserve, intended to counter exactly the kind of armored breakthrough that the coalition's left hook represented. The Tawakalna Division had dug in along a north-south oriented ridgeline that American military maps designated using a grid reference system, and the specific east-west line along which McMaster's squadron was advancing intersected that ridgeline at the 73 Easting Grid line. What followed has become known to military history as the Battle of 73 Easting, and it lasted approximately 23 minutes. The Iraqi positions that McMaster's tanks encountered as the sandstorm cleared were prepared defensive positions. Tanks and armored personnel carriers dug into revetments that provided protection from frontal fire, supported by artillery that had been registered on the approaches to the position. By the standards of conventional military assessment, it was a textbook defensive position, occupied by an elite formation, against which an attacking force would normally expect to take significant casualties in the process of reducing it. What the Iraqi defenders of the Tawakalna Division had not adequately accounted for, in their preparation of that defensive position, was the specific combination of equipment and training that American armored forces brought to the engagement. The M1A1 Abrams tank that McMaster commanded, and that equipped the rest of his squadron, possessed thermal imaging sights that allowed gunners to identify targets through smoke, dust, and darkness conditions that would have rendered earlier generation tanks effectively blind. The sandstorm that had limited visibility to less than 1,000 meters for human eyes did not equally limit the thermal sights of the Abrams tanks, which could detect the heat signatures of Iraqi tanks and vehicles at ranges that exceeded the range at which those Iraqi vehicles could detect and engage the approaching Americans. The 120mm main gun of the M1A1, firing depleted uranium sabot rounds, could penetrate the armor of any tank in the Iraqi inventory, including the T-72, at ranges that exceeded the maximum effective range of the T-72's own gun against the Abrams's frontal armor. What this combination meant, in the specific tactical reality of February 26, 1991, was that American tanks could see Iraqi positions before Iraqi crews could see the American tanks, and could engage and destroy Iraqi tanks at ranges where Iraqi return fire, even if it found the American tanks could not penetrate their armor. Eagle Troops tanks began engaging the Iraqi positions at ranges of approximately 2,500 meters, identifying targets through the thermal sights and firing main gun rounds that began destroying Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles before most of the Iraqi crews had identified that they were under attack. The engagement that followed was not a battle in the sense of two forces exchanging fire with comparable effect. It was, in the assessment that military historians and the participants themselves have offered consistently since, closer to a systematic destruction of a defended position by a force whose technological and training advantages had created conditions under which the defenders could not effectively respond. Sergeant Nathaniel Rogers, a gunner in Eagle Troop, described the engagement in terms that captured the specific character of what was happening. "We were seeing them before they could see us," Rogers said. The thermal sights would pick up the heat signature of a tank. Sometimes the engine block was the brightest part because they'd been running it to stay warm, and you'd identify it, lay the gun, and fire, and you'd see the hit and the secondary explosion, and you'd move to the next one. It was happening so fast that by the time some of their crews realized there was an engagement going on, their tank had already been hit. The American tanks advanced through the Iraqi position as they destroyed it, maintaining the momentum of their advance while systematically eliminating the Iraqi vehicles in their path. The Iraqi artillery that had been positioned to support the defensive line attempted to engage the advancing Americans, but the counterfire that American artillery and the advancing tanks themselves directed against the Iraqi guns suppressed and destroyed them before they could establish effective fire. The engagement expanded as additional squadrons of 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment and elements of the 1st Infantry Division that were following behind the cavalry screen became engaged with the broader Tawakalna Division positions that extended along the ridgeline. By the time the engagement that began at 73 Easting concluded, in an action that the participants describe as having intensified and then concluded within approximately 23 minutes for Eagle Troops' portion of it, the result was the destruction of approximately 28 to 30 Iraqi tanks, numerous armored personnel carriers, and artillery pieces, with American losses limited to a small number of vehicles damaged, none destroyed, and minimal personnel casualties. The disparity in the outcome, an elite Iraqi division losing dozens of armored vehicles in a defensive engagement against an American cavalry squadron that suffered essentially no losses, reflected the specific technological and training gap between the two forces that the Gulf War had revealed at every level of engagement. The broader Battle of 73 Easting, encompassing the actions of multiple American units against the Tawakalna Division's positions along the ridgeline over the following hours, resulted in the destruction of the bulk of the division's combat power, removing the most capable Iraqi armored formation from the battlefield in a single afternoon's fighting. The technological factors that produced this outcome were significant and have been studied extensively in the decades since, but the technological factors alone do not fully explain what happened at 73 Easting. The training that American tank crews had received, the gunnery skills that had been developed through years of practice on ranges in Germany and the United States, the crew coordination that allowed a four-man tank crew to identify, engage, and destroy targets at a rate that overwhelmed the Iraqi defenders' ability to respond, these were human factors that the equipment alone did not produce. The American military that fought at 73 Easting was the product of the post-Vietnam reconstruction of the United States Army, the systematic rebuilding of training, equipment, and doctrine that had been underway since the 1970s in response to the lessons that Vietnam and the broader Cold War competition with the Soviet Union had taught. The Republican Guard, by contrast, was the product of an Iraqi military culture that, despite the quality of its Soviet-supplied equipment, had not developed the training systems and the crew proficiency that turned equipment into combat effectiveness. The result was an engagement where equipment that was, on paper, broadly comparable in capability between the T-72 and the M1A1, produced outcomes that were not comparable at all, because the systems that surrounded the equipment, the sights, the training, the coordination, the doctrine, produced a combat effectiveness gap that the raw specifications of the tanks did not capture. Captain McMaster, who would go on to a distinguished military career and eventually serve as National Security Advisor, wrote about the Battle of 73 Easting in terms that emphasized what the engagement demonstrated about American military capability at the end of the Cold War era. The Republican Guard was the best the Iraqi army had, McMaster wrote. They were dug in, they had good equipment, and they were in a position they had chosen and prepared. What happened to them in those minutes was not because they were poor soldiers in some absolute sense. It was because the gap between what they had trained for and what they faced was a gap that no amount of individual courage could close. We saw them before they saw us. We could hit them before they could hit us. That is not a close fight. That is a different category of fight entirely. The Battle of 73 Easting has been studied by military academies and war colleges around the world as one of the clearest examples in modern military history of how technological and training advantages can produce outcomes that conventional force ratio calculations do not predict. The Tawakalna Division, by the conventional metrics that military planners use to assess defensive positions, an elite formation with capable equipment in prepared positions, should have been able to inflict significant casualties on an attacking force even if ultimately defeated. It inflicted essentially none. The broader Gulf War ground campaign, of which 73 Easting was one engagement among many similar engagements across the theater, lasted exactly 100 hours from the beginning of the ground offensive to the ceasefire. The Iraqi army that had been the fourth largest in the world, that had fought an 8-year war against Iran to a bloody stalemate, that had occupied and annexed Kuwait with minimal resistance, was destroyed as a fighting force across the entire theater in approximately 4 days. The men who fought at 73 Easting understood, in the immediate aftermath of the engagement, that they had been part of something that the broader public would not fully appreciate for years, an engagement whose tactical details would be studied for decades because of what it revealed about the state of military technology and training at a specific moment in history. What they experienced in the moment was the specific intensity of combat compressed into minutes rather than hours, the sandstorm clearing to reveal an enemy formation, the immediate engagement, the systematic destruction of that formation, and then the continuation of the advance toward objectives that the engagement at 73 Easting had been a step toward rather than a destination in itself. Sergeant Rogers, asked decades later what he remembered most about the battle, did not describe the tactical details that military historians have analyzed so extensively. "I remember how fast it was," Rogers said. "You trained for years. You learned the gunnery, the crew drills, all of it. And then it happens, and it's 20 minutes, and it's over, and the desert in front of you looks completely different than it did 20 minutes before. That's what I remember. How fast everything we'd trained for actually happened. That is 73 Easting. 23 minutes that destroyed an elite division, and that demonstrated, in the clearest terms that modern military history has produced, what the gap between trained and prepared American armored forces and even an enemy's best equipped and most capable units actually looked like when that gap was tested in combat. The sandstorm cleared. The tanks were there. And in 23 minutes, they were not.